with us today and sharing your expertise with us today. It's truly an honor to have you here today. Thank you so much, Trevor. Thank you. Um, I had a little biography of your professional, but I think I will pass and give you the screen to you. Okay, please be free to start.
Let me share the screen.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And again, thank you everyone for your patience as I fumbled through getting these slides to work. I'm not sure what's up with my computer, but I'll figure it out later. But in any event, I'm thrilled to be here with all of you to talk a bit about some of my work with archives and thinking about the future of archives. And so with that, if you want to move to the next slide. This is a roadmap for my talk today. So I'm going to give you a little background on me, my work, where I come from. I'll talk a little bit about two of my recent books. So The Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation, where that work came from, and a bit about my most recent book, After Disruption, A Future for Cultural Memory. And so I'm a researcher as well as a practicing leader in a library archives organization. So I'll talk a little bit about the American Institute of Physics, our research team, and where our library and archives fits in that. And then move into talking a bit about the way that we're trying to approach moving from being really collections focused to being focused on the connections, the relationships that exist within our archives and collections, and the way that we can build our collections in tandem with community and deepen belonging. And that gets at the last point, which is treating the work of an archives as a laboratory for thinking about the future of archival practice. So if you move to you can move to the next slide. So for a little background on me, I'm a librarian, archivist, social scientist, and a historian with a background in the history of science, federal funding in the United States, digital preservation, and curation. You can move to the next slide. Here's a couple of pictures of some work from across my career. The first picture there is me at the Library of Congress. I'm standing, it's Bill Nye that I'm talking to right there, which in the US, he's the science guy. So he's a big sort of popular science figure. And I was showing him Carl Sagan's papers. So while I was at the Library of Congress, I had the chance to work with our history of science collections and help people engage and explore collections like Carl Sagan's papers, who was a popularizer and a really important astronomer and physicist in the United States. Up in the right, that's me with my team of staff at the Institute of Museum and Library Services, where we were celebrating the launch of a report on a whole series of initiatives we had funded related to digital infrastructure for libraries and museums. And then in the bottom corner there, that's in 2022, I was at the National Library of Kosovo as a Fulbright specialist, helping them develop their first digital strategy, which really focused on how their national library could serve as a resource in helping them meet many of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and also connect with their diaspora communities around the world. So you can move to the next slide. So as I'd mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about two of my books, The Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation, which came out in 2018, and After Disruption, A Future for Cultural Memory. My works really started out being focused much more in digital preservation. And then as I'll discuss, After Disruption comes out from trying to think about sort of the bigger picture issues that emerge from digital preservation. So I'll talk about that as we move forward a little bit. So you can move to the next slide. So the digital preservation book that I wrote really grew out of my teaching practice. So this is a screenshot of the syllabus for the digital preservation course I taught at the University of Maryland in 2016. And when I started teaching this course, I was not particularly happy with any of the books that were out there. So I used a lot of other resources. It felt like a lot of the work in digital preservation sort of started in the middle. It was highly technical and really didn't connect with sort of the traditions and practices in libraries and archives. So if you move to the next slide, a core part of the way I taught that course was having students work with small cultural heritage organizations on digital preservation planning for those groups. And so the first report there is from one of my students, Tracy, who now actually works at the Library of Congress, but she worked with the College Park Aviation Museum, a very small museum, actually not far away from where I am here in Maryland. And then another one of my students, Gwendolyn, she worked with the Old Trails Museum out in the American West, another small organization. And so in many cases, when my students would work with these organizations, they're just a handful of staff, and people are trying to think through the most pressing risks that their digital collections face. That's often, one spilt cup of coffee away from someone losing all these oral histories or something that's just stored locally on one computer. So helping people think about how to back things up, make redundant copies. That was sort of a core part of that. You can move to the next slide. So that resulted in this book, The Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation. And if you move one more forward, I'll give you a little more of a tour of the book. So the book starts out with this sort of dichotomy. We're often told that, things that we post online will just be there forever. It's sort of the kind of story that I think often is told to young people to scare them into being more deliberate about what they share online. And if you move to the next slide, it's somewhat jarring that we also see this story all the time too, right? So this is a Science Friday story. Scientists warn we might be creating a digital dark age. This idea that we might lose all of our digital information at once just seems somewhat jarring in contrast to those stories that we be worried that everything might be around forever. And that kind of hyperbole really surrounds digital information. So this is the structure of the book. I start with working through that kind of hype and anxiety, go into the different lineages that we have in preservation traditions, everything from microfilming to environmental conditions and HVAC systems to oil painting conservation, folklore, right? All these different things, and they kind of all collapse together in the digital environment in this really interesting way, where when we get down to understanding those digital objects, it's just a really different space. So the book really makes a case that there's this craft of digital preservation, and here you can see some of the responses that I've gotten to it. You can get the book online. There's also an open access Spanish translation of the book that the UNAM published, which I was really thrilled to see come out. But here are a couple responses to it. The first from former archivist of the United States, David Ferriero, who really stressed that we're part of this tradition of memory keepers. And then the second one from Kyle Rimkus at the University of Illinois, who I really liked this idea that I was suggesting we needed to course correct. So on one hand, we're in this tradition of knowledge keepers, but at the same time, the book really tries to be an intervention to get people to start doing things to get the boxes off the floor, right? That it's not sort of this highly technical field, but that making copies and managing them and that sort of thing is something we can all start doing today. So if you move to the next one, some of the most rewarding comments I've gotten on the book are things like this, which is a post from Goodreads. And so Christy is sharing that she's a solo archivist, and she's always been anxious about how to deal with digital preservation, but she really likes the case studies, her practical approach of it. And then in the end, she's also noting that there's like there's broader sets of issues about climate change and social justice and neoliberalism that come up towards the end of the book. And that's really kind of the jumping off point that went into my next book. And so you can move to the next slide. The last chapter of my digital preservation book is called Tools for Looking Forward. And the point there is that when we're really thinking about digital preservation, we're actually talking about access in the future. And so as a result, we need to engage with the tools that futurists use to think about, 50 or 100 years from now, how is someone going to read or access this? Will people still be able to use a mouse? Will they know how to interact with a web browser? all those kinds of things. But then we also have to think organizationally about the long-term viability of the organizations that make preservation possible. So are people going to be investing resources in libraries and archives? Is there sort of public will for our institutions? And when you think about things like climate change, what is the nature of how resources are going to work going to be 50 or 100 years from now. So that is the jumping off point for After Disruption, A Future for Cultural Memory, which was the book that I started on there in 2011. And so if you move to the next slide, a jumping off point for that book was this quote from Stephen Jackson in a widely cited essay called Rethinking Repair. And so he asks us to take erosion, breakdown, and decay rather than novelty and growth and progress as our starting points in thinking through the nature, use, and effects of information technology and new media. And so this is a really interesting sort of turning on its head of the way that people often talk about innovation, that he, in his case, looks at how sort of global waste gets reused or recycled, how ships get broken down and brought back together, and offers this really creative way of thinking about how innovation really happens. And so if you move to the next slide, this is an overview of After Disruption, that book. So I start by talking through a bit about what cultural memory is and ideas about the future, and then talk through what I see as three really bankrupt ideas around disruptive innovation, data-driven decision-making, and sort of hustle culture and problems with overworking and overextending the work of libraries and librarians. At this point, libraries and archives are called upon to do just about everything or anything. That the social welfare kind of functions are really growing and the resources aren't necessarily growing for them. And so then the second half of the book focuses on what I've suggested are several ways forward, really grounded in a lot of work from feminist and Black feminist theorists in the United States, talking about the maintenance mindset. So thinking about maintenance, care, and repair as ways to really focus on the future of cultural memory. And so if you move to the next slide, there's one big quote I wanted to share with everyone that comes from Michelle Caswell in a great essay she wrote called Seeing Yourself in History, Community Archives, and the Fight Against Symbolic Annihilation. And I think this is a really sort of focal thing that I will draw on as I then move into some more practical things in some of the work we do at AIP. So the key elements here is that when we really draw on the fact that so many marginalized communities face a form of symbolic annihilation, that their stories aren't part of archives, they can't see themselves reflected in them, that really pushes us to make very deliberate efforts to collect voices that have been marginalized by the mainstream. And so that is one of these core parts in that care and repair function that I'll be talking about a little more practically in some of the examples that follow. So if you move to the next slide. So that's kind of the very theory part of my talk, and now I'll give a little more context about my newish job as the Chief Research Officer at the American Institute of Physics, which, as you'll note, I am not a physicist. We don't do research, or my team does not do research in physics. We do research about physics and the physical sciences community more broadly. And so if you move to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about this. So our research team brings together teams of people focused on this goal to empower positive change in the physical sciences. So we have historians, we have sociologists, I have librarians and archivists on the team, but this is why we do the work we do. It's why we have an archives, is what we're attempting to do, that we're empowering positive change. So if you move to the next slide. This is the team. So this is the sociologists, historians, librarians, and archivists who all work together here to collect and preserve, document, and help people explore and understand, and really to support change. It's not just sort of studying the past for its own sake, but to learn from the past and help our communities of scientists leverage that information to support change. And so if you move to the next slide. When I started, we went through and looked at our teams. So we have a history and policy team, statistical research team and a library and archives team. And I think oh, great. I think they got themselves muted. You can think about those teams independently of each other, but when we look at the work we do all together, it's really related to connecting. So we do oral histories with people, we send out surveys, we have reference services. These are ways we connect with people. We then collect, we gather stories and materials into our collections. We create content, we share newsletters or publish reports, we produce metadata, and then we curate and manage collections. And that happens across all of these teams. So if you move to the next slide, we developed this as a way of thinking about our whole framework, right? So how do we empower positive change? Well, the way we do it is by having our research team there in the middle with our librarians, our historians, our policy analysts, our social scientists. We're facilitating a continual dialogue with those physical science communities. So AIP publishes a widely read magazine called Physics Today that's sent out to over 100,000 scientists in different fields. AIP is a federation of scientific societies. So we have the major societies in the United States for physicists, astronomers, meteorologists. They're all members of those societies, and we try to provide resources to them. Importantly, we're also the repository for the organizational records of 8 of the 10 of those member societies. So when people want to come and study how the American Astronomical Society was founded or what things were being discussed in the American Physical Society's board meetings in the 1960s, they come to us to use those resources. And then we also have the Student Physics Society, which coordinates work with undergraduate students interested in physics and supports them in sort of advancing their careers and their learning. So we're really trying to think about how we take those disciplinary research communities, our historians, our librarians, our archivists, and connect them and their work into being useful in supporting positive change in those physical science communities. We move to the next slide. So we've identified 4 areas that we really focus that work in. So we're working on supporting a welcoming culture and removing barriers to opportunity for all in the physical sciences. We're advancing thought leadership and public policy in the physical sciences. We're working to ensure records of 20th and 21st science are both preserved and used, that they're supporting that positive change. And then we're also promoting vibrant career trajectories for physical science professionals. So helping people understand what the possibilities are, and our library and archives plays a role in all of those areas. So you can move to the next slide. One of the ways we're doing this is we publish a research agenda every year. This is our first one in 2025. So several of these are sort of social science research projects, but there's also history work. So looking at the century of breakthroughs in quantum science and technology. And then that Faces of the Physical Sciences project at the end is actually an effort to collect and preserve really broad representation of our communities in our visual collections. And I'll talk about that a little more in some of the examples that come. So this is the statement that Robert Oppenheimer, you can see him there, well known for his work on the Manhattan Project and beyond. He spoke at the opening of our library and archives in 1962. And the big idea he was pushing was that the enterprises now underway, and which this library room would serve as a hearth for, should make it so that any serious students of the human predicament in the future could understand the discoveries in the sciences are among the great epics and should be available in our tradition. Undertakings of which this new library will be the home. So this is that jumping off point. You can move to the next slide. And so in practice, this is a bit of what that looks like. So this is we publish a newsletter, and in the first edition of that newsletter since I joined, I was sharing out about this bright, collaborative, interdisciplinary future that we were looking for. And at the same time, there's a picture of Kai, who was our student intern, Physics Society intern that summer. And so Kai came to work with us and is now he's switched from physics. He's doing work in the history of science. And I'll share a little bit about some things he worked on and how they fit into this broader strategy. So you can move to the next slide. So one of the things that Kai did was he conducted a series of oral histories, and he shared out about some of the work he did to collect those oral histories in a blog post called The Power of Oral Histories. Here you can see an oral history he did, or see an image related to oral histories he did with Renee K. Horton, Renee Horton, and Jan Eldridge. And he shared in this blog post that he was really inspired, as you might imagine. The majority of the oral histories in our collections are representative of sort of the very white, very male side of the physical sciences community in the US. And Kai was really interested in making sure that we documented and preserved stories that were more broadly representative of people involved in science. And so we now have Renee Horton's amazing story about her work at NASA and Jan Eldridge's story as part of our collections. So you move to the next slide. Along with that, while Kai was a student with us, he did some in-depth research at the Library of Congress on Frank Kameny, the astronomer. This is an article he wrote for Physics Today, which again then went out to those 100,000 scientists who subscribe to, who get our publications. And Kai did some really great groundbreaking research on Frank Kameny, who was a gay rights leader in the United States who also had was fired during what's called the Lavender Scare. So there was basically alongside of or before the Red Scare in the United States, there was an attempt to ferret out and fire all of the people working in the U.S. government who were gay, and Kameny was fired through that process. But then became this really powerful gay rights leader. And Kai was working to uncover and share out some of Frank Kameny's work and stories as an astronomer, again, highlighting people whose stories have been silenced or excised from the history of science. You can move to the next slide. So another thing that we do related to the way some of what I was talking about connecting, really going beyond collections to connections. A really interesting part of our collection is unpublished memoirs from physical scientists. So here is a picture of Shakespeare Got It Wrong. It's Not to Be, It's to Do, the memoirs of a geophysicist by Jack Oliver. And I've included this bit here from the preface. And so when I pulled this up and read it in our library, I was really excited to see that in the preface, Jack Oliver talks about how this autobiography was stimulated by a joint request from the History on Geophysics in the American Geophysical Union, which is one of AIP's affiliate member societies, and the Center for the History of Physics at the American Institute of Physics. Otherwise, I might not have attempted it. And so what's really powerful here is to come across a resource like this that really was called into being because it was invited, right? This is not, we're not just collecting things that exist in the world, but we're actually openly inviting, we have a history of doing this, people to tell their stories, and then for those stories to be added to our collections. So if you move to the next slide. The book's a lot of fun, alongside all of his sort of detailed information about the geophysics research he did. He was an important figure in the development of plate tectonics, which is obviously a core part of how we understand Earth systems today. But he also included these fun limerick interludes. So he's just got, they're sort of like little poem joke things. I think sort of give you a very strong sense of his character and his humor. So it's nice to see these kinds of things come through. And you can move to the next slide. I'll share another example of one of these manuscript biographies. So A Career in Crystallography by Elizabeth Moore is another unpublished memoir. I believe we're one of 2 or 3 places in the world that have this. I'm showing you a copy there. One of the pages in there actually includes photos of all of her Girl Scout badges when she was growing up. She was a scout. So it's got some really fun things about her early life and career. If you move to the next slide, there's a multi-page spread in the book. She was featured in Mademoiselle magazine in the United States while she was working as a student. She's described here as crystal analyst Elizabeth Jean Wachau, talking about her plans to get a PhD in crystallography. she did go on, she studied crystallography and then also a lot of advanced work in optics. And so if you move forward again, there's a couple more pictures. Here she is in the Harvard Department of Mineralogy. And then some later photos, she's working in clean rooms. She went on to work in industry with IBM and a number of different places, played a significant role in one of our societies, the American Crystallographic Association, and also in optics research. And so we have our story and it's preserved in our collections. We're looking to digitize it and make it openly available online, which will really expand access to it. If you move to the next one. What's really exciting, so this is another one of those manuscript biographies. This is Stephen Dick, Stardust Memories, the Dick Family History and Memoir. Stephen was the historian at NASA for a long time, and he wrote this several hundred-page volume talking about his family history and work he did with all kinds of famous NASA scientists. And because of the nature of digital information and systems, anyone can just go. He gave us a PDF of this. We were able to sign off on, get him to sign off on permissions, and it's openly available for anyone to go download and read. So, when you think about the digital era we're in, a lot of things around ebooks or access to gated resource content is really hard and makes it harder to enable access to materials. But in cases like this, when you're dealing with people's personal stories, the web is tremendously powerful as a way for us to be able to solicit, invite, and then share back with our community people's personal stories. We can move to the next slide. And we've been attempting to do just this. So this is an article that I wrote for Radiations magazine. It's a publication we put out to Sigma Pi Sigma, the honor society for physicists and astronomers in the United States. Me basically telling the story I was just telling you about Jack Oliver's memoir and Elizabeth Moore's memoir, and inviting other people to share their stories. So if you move forward, we put out a monthly newsletter now, and this was in the most recent monthly newsletter, where you can see Jan Eldridge's oral history, which Kai had done. I was telling you about that earlier, up online. And then you can see Joseph Alexander, Brad Roth, Philip Kepner, and Edna Weigel's memoirs are all up online now too. And all four of those memoirs are stories that we received back from that invitation I put in that Sigma Pi Sigma magazine. So you're seeing the sort of full culmination again of that story I had about Jack Oliver. There's now, if you read several of these memoirs, they start with, I wrote this story because of the invitation Trevor Owens posted put up in Radiations magazine. And so we're continuing that tradition of inviting and sharing stories. Can you move to the next slide? We have the same kind of relationship to photographic collections. So the Ronald E. Mickens collection is one of our real treasures. Mickens is an important African-American physicist in the United States. He played significant roles in the Black Physicists Society, the National Society of Black Physicists in the United States, as well as the American Physical Society. And in the beginning of the 21st century, he curated a collection of materials related to African-American physicists, and then he gave those to us to add to our collection. So if you move forward, you'll see a number of photos from the collection there on the side. So there's a whole series of photos. You can browse and explore them there. And as part of that effort to make sure that our materials are not only available, but also used, we have an episode of a podcast we did called Initial Conditions that really deeply explores the collection and tells stories about how it was put together, trying to help support access and use of it. You can move forward again. Our visual archives, which the Mickens collection is a part of, is more broadly called the Emilio Segre Visual Archives. So here are some photos. Segre was an immigrant to the United States. He had fled Mussolini's Italy to then come to the United States and work on the Manhattan Project, where many of his photos in his collection are candid photographs from work on the atomic bomb. But you'll see here too that he is an amateur astronomer or an amateur photographer, along with being a professional physicist. And so he documented his life and his work extensively, and then gifted that material to us. And also we were gifted funds to help support our photo collection. And so our real strengths in our photography collection are anchored in amateur photos from scientists. And if you move forward, we're doing a lot to build on that tradition in the same way that receiving those manuscript unpublished memoirs is now easier than ever in a digital environment. It's very easy to bring in donations of digital photographs. Here's a photo of Doreen Haddad, who was explaining to me on a tour at our National Institute of Standards and Technology how the kibble balance worked. I won't get into the details here, but it is a fascinating device that's effectively the most accurate measurement of mass possible. She's involved in that fundamental measurement group at NIST. So I took these photos, and then we've added them now to our collection. So they are part of our ongoing documentation of people and work in the physical sciences. We'll move to the next slide. We've now, as part of that Faces of the Physical Sciences initiative, we've added the ability for anyone to upload photos and share them with us. So it also works on a mobile device, so people can now, students and people in the physics and physical sciences community more broadly can just upload and submit photos to us, which we can then quickly add to our digital repository. We can be in this sort of community memory hub within our spaces. So if you move to the next slide. Stepping back from all of this, I'll just talk a little bit about what I see as some of the implications of this work. So instead of just thinking about the Niels Bohr Library and Archives as, a set of books, a set of papers, a set of photographs, I think these examples here show how the library itself can serve as a laboratory for how we develop a reparative archival future. So how do we help address gaps and problems? How do we help make our space more welcoming, our community more welcoming? And how can the archive be an instrument of enabling that? So that's something that I think all of those examples I shared work towards. At the same time, it's a personal memorial to physical scientists. This is a place for their stories to go, where they can find belonging and connection. And that I think comes through really well with those unpublished memoirs, which wouldn't otherwise have a home. But at the same time, we're also a cultivator of a legacy mindset among that science community. So asking people to think about the future, to think about the past, to step back and document their stories is a powerful way to do that. It's also a facilitator of intergenerational dialogue and interdisciplinary dialogue between physical scientists and historians and social scientists, so that we're inviting older generations to tell their stories. We're trying to get younger generations of scientists to engage with them. And we're bringing together these historians and social scientists that can help parse through and think about what the past means for the future of our science. And then lastly, that we're a trusted source in an increasingly untrusting world, that everyone, our small team here, really does work and support these materials and can assure people of their provenance and the fact that these are in fact authentic materials. And so if you go to the next slide, I've got just an invitation here. If you're curious about some of the things that I've shared out, you can go to aip.org/research/subscribe, and there you can subscribe to a weekly edition of our newsletter, which gives out one article every Friday about something going on in the history of science, history of physical sciences community. You can also subscribe to that monthly update, which is where you saw the newly added memoirs and oral histories that I showed a screenshot of earlier, or our research updates, which is a resource you can use to learn about new reports or social science research that we publish. And so that is sort of a capstone to that. And with that, I think we're ready now for questions.
Thank you, Trevor, for the presentations. I have one question, what was the main challenge when you start digital preservation, the memoirs?
Yeah, so one of the things that's great about the memoirs and really all of the materials that I've shown here is they're actually very simple and straightforward for digital preservation. Our memoirs, that they're PDFs or they're Word documents, they're files that are pretty standard and they're going to be relatively easy to open well into the future. And then we do maintain multiple copies of all of those materials in our repository environments. But interestingly, the biggest challenges tend to be just making sure everyone is following the same standard operating procedures, that people are redundantly backing up materials and making copies of them in the right ways, and that we really have everyone working in the same way. So as people change jobs or move into different roles, that those handoffs are really well managed. And so we've been doing a fair amount to improve our documentation and make sure everyone's trained in the same ways to use the tools. But thankfully, our collections are not particularly large. We're talking about gigabytes or terabytes of information, not petabytes of information. Where I used to work at the Library of Congress, it was 20 petabytes of data for a copy of the collections. It's just much more challenging to deal with a lot of the technical issues that come from scale.
Okay, thank you. I have another question that is, did you find some resistance for digital preservation with physics, or they are open, they have an open mind for that?
Yeah, great question. So uh, a great part of the physical sciences community really cares a lot about its history, and has for a long time. I think that fact that, our library, Robert Oppenheimer opened it and was really concerned about stories and people's stories. So there's a lot of understanding there. And then a useful thing with physicists and astronomers, particularly astronomers within the physical sciences community, really understand the value of historical data. So it really is a core part of how they do their work, is to have access to old data. So it's very easy for them to understand the value of old information in a way that I think people in other fields might not. So there's a lot of concern about data preservation, and then also the community is very concerned about the journal literature, so ensuring access to scholarly publications. But from there, it's pretty straightforward for them to jump to the value of their association records, their meetings, and these various resources. So I think my sense is that that's true for most scholarly communities as well. But it is, I think, important for I'd love to see more organizations like we do within the physical science community doing this for other disciplinary-based communities, because that's often where people's identities are tied to. And ultimately, in this sort of connections framework, really we need to be thinking about how to mobilize and connect with people's identities, the stories that matter to them, the people in their community that matter to them, and how we can make sure that's at the forefront of what we're doing, instead of sort of focusing so much about the materials themselves.
Okay, thank you, Trevor. I don't know if there is more questions with our audience. Uh, you can write them on the chat or just ask directly.
I have one question.
Mm.
I saw that you allow everyone to upload photographies, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Do you have a specific format for allowing, or no? Or it is
Great question. Yeah, so uh we don't have strict format requirements for photos. In general, our sense is that the commonly used photograph formats, so JPEG,
if
TIFF, those sorts of things. And really, I mean, for the most part, we're getting JPEGs or PNG files, because those are the kinds of things that people tend to produce. And while there are certain preservation risks associated with the compression algorithms and things like that related to JPEGs, there's the implementations for viewers of JPEG are so wide that a lot of organizations are accepting that risk. It's worth noting too that even where I used to work at the Library of Congress, they have switched the master format for digitization to be JPEG 2000 instead of TIFFs because the compression rate, that the lossless compression is so powerful that it's 20 times less data storage. And I think significantly when we're thinking about formats, there's now more and more of an opportunity to actually think about if a file can be 20 times less in size, not only does that mean you can do more work, you could have 20 times more files, you can also, they're easier to use and access for end users so that that gets improved. And then if you are thinking about the energy and sort of climate footprint of your organization, smaller files are it's sort of a fit for purpose question. But you're very right that there are there are some in the community who really still try to stress getting people to produce and use TIFF files because they don't have that compression component to them. But it's an interesting thing to weigh out those trade-offs in different communities.
Okay, it's more sustainable, right?
Yeah, exactly. The file format itself for TIFF, is in theory, more it is sort of, from first principles, you could derive a way to reopen a TIFF file in a way that it would be much more challenging to do that with a JPEG file. But at the same time, if we're at a point where we can't open any JPEGs, we're in a bad place, sort of like civilization-wide in general, because they're so commonly and widely used that they're really implemented in a lot of open source browsers. There's all kinds of tools for them. So it was a great question.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have some more questions in the chat, and the first one is Sylvia, and she said, "Hello, Mr. Owens. Do you think that the present political condition can influence in any way your work?"
Sure. So I think the starting point that I'd note there is that within the United States, the massive cancellation of grants from the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the cancellation of grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities is having a huge effect on the institutions that collect and preserve memory. So that is a big deal. I think the big issue there too is that there is a disagreement within within American politics on what the role of the federal government should be in memory and collecting. And so there has been a longstanding effort to defund that work at the federal level with the idea that it should happen through other kinds of organizations. And so we're seeing that sort of come to fruition. Along with that, it's worth noting that our National Archives has long really been challenged to deal with the scale of the problem they face. And there's always sort of budget constraints. But I think when you particularly think about the scale of what information is produced by the US government at this point in time, there are a lot of people who have been advocating for more resources for our National Archives, but it's likely they will see less. And so I do think that it puts us in a situation as a community where we do need to think a lot about how to support collecting and preserving memory. I think part of the reason that Robert Oppenheimer really wanted us to start our archives and collections was because he was worried about who was going to be able to tell the story of a lot of classified research that might never see the light of day or those sorts of things, and doing oral histories with, scientists is a way to get some of those stories. So I do think there's a big need for communities to collaborate and figure out how to share resources to document and preserve what we can. And also that there's, a really wide movement pushing and advocating for the central role that archives and libraries play in supporting democratic institutions and society. And so, within the US space, there's a lot of advocacy within the library and archives community to try and make sure that resources are put to bear and that the right work is done to bolster and support critical public institutions.
Thank you. We have one more question in the chat, and it's Gustavo, and he asks, "Do you have an idea of the impact on the preservation of archival information of the recent decisions by the central government to destroy archival files has been reported?"
Yeah, I don't know as much about this as I could. I think we're still learning more as we go. I think what I will say is I'm very glad that there are organizations in the United States like the Internet Archive or the End of Term Web Archiving Initiative is a big collaboration between a lot of different universities that collect and preserve documents and resources. And whether or not anything nefarious is going on within any government and any institution, it is inherently really good to have a lot of copies of these materials. So I think that is something that collaborations between libraries and archives to collect and preserve digital information is really important, and it's, I think, even more so important.
Thank you, Trevor. We have one more question, and this time is from Margarita Almeida, and she asked, "Do you have perceived any change in the public understanding of science, physics, through the opening of the archive to the public voice by collecting oral contributions?"
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure about broadly public understanding of science. It's really hard to address that. I will um, the American the Association of Science and Technology Centers, ASTEC in the United States, had some really great survey data recently that goes in depth on uh, within American citizens in the United States. There is still widely trust in science. There's some specific areas where there's concerns, but I think it's important to note that there is a lot of trust in science. But a thing that I will note about the value of those oral histories and those records is that I'm really our audience first and foremost is the scientific community, which is those 100,000 some members of the societies, and then more broadly, probably 500,000 or so scientists, engineers, et cetera, in connected into those communities. And we're really excited we have historians who come in and make great use of our archives to write, in-depth studies or biographies. Some of those do get out into the broader popular culture. But many of them also find a way to help the scientists themselves and early career scientists understand the important connections between science and society, or the sort of ways that the institutions evolve and develop. And so that dialogue between the historians and the scientists tends to be very useful for both, that the historians get a better, more nuanced understanding of the science, and the scientific community gets a little more context for understanding how they do their work and the way that ideas are developed and shaped over time.
Thank you, Trevor. I don't know if there is more questions. I just want to acknowledge for the presentation. It was a very good presentation, and I hope we can continuing sharing some impressions through the email, because it's very important to share knowledge through different institutions, so we can achieve more and more great things. So I believe there is no more questions. I will just let my director, Dr. Cristina Cortes, to finish the session.
Thank you so much, Trevor. Thank you for allowing us to share your life expertise and your work. I did already add in the chat the link of the scribe,
Oh,
the
thank you.
newsletter, okay?
Yeah,
Okay, thank you. I have one more question.
yeah.
Relating to the uploads of the photographies. Do you have any way of have the description of the photography, or it is only the object, the digital object itself?
Great question. So we do the form that we have up online. But I can even share the link to it too, so that
Okay.
everyone can see it. I'll pull that up really quick. So if you go to our website, and go to the libraries part of our website, we ask the users to describe their photos when they upload them, and
Okay.
also to give us permission to make them available. So that's built into our submission form. And we also have on the page. Pull this up real quick. Library. We also have our collection development policy because we don't take everyone's photo, right? We don't take any photo. We have specific types of photos that we take, and so the donor fills in the form, gives the photo a title, gives a description, identifies the photographer, the location, and then all of that data comes in as a CSV file that we use to then make part of our metadata for adding it to our digital repository so that it's searchable and discoverable.
Okay.
It was a great question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, I think the webinar is in the end. It's finished. Okay. Thank you so much, Trevor. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And again, apologies for my technical issues at the beginning, but thank you for being so nimble and responsive with finding another way to share my slides. I really
Thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much. Thank you so much for your patience, okay, and sharing all your knowledge with us. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.